So you often hear people throw out the phrase, communism has never been tried before. And I thought we'd have a little look into that today because often that's a very controversial statement that'll get people fired up on both sides. So let's have a little bit of a deep dive in this and have a look at some of the key points. So what we have here is a map of countries that America has enacted regime change in. You could overlay a map of countries that have attempted communism and you'd have pretty much the same map. This is a very important point as we're about to find out. So first of all, we need to understand that communism isn't a monolith, just as, capitalism and democracy are not monoliths. I mean, you could look at America today and you could probably make the case that it is an example of failed democracy. And, perhaps you'd be right. And you could do the same thing with a lot of communist countries because they have varying success as well. But well, first of all, let's look at the fact that there are different types of communism. I mean, when Vietnam had its communist basic revolution from the French occupation, they had, Ho Chi Minh had a very, very nationalistic view of communism. Like, he didn't care about the world view of it. He only cared about liberating Vietnam. And he believed in communism, and that was the best way to do it. You look at someone like Lenin, who was absolutely a globalist, who believed that we should be overthrowing the entire world and, changing everything to a proletariat utopia. Stalin was also a bit more imperialistic. He didn't quite have that view that the whole world should be taken over. We should take enough of a chunk to create the foundation of, global communism for the future. And then you got, people like Mao Zedong, who again was very nationalistic and believed far more in creating just a China-centric version of communism to create their own sphere of influence. And you've got Cuba, who are also quite isolationist. They don't believe in they believe in the global proletariat, but we're not going to be the ones to do it. And you can find every kind of combination of these factors in countries too, just as you find very complicated and diverse forms of democracy. But there is one thing that every single communist country has in common, and that's this map. Because any time anyone attempts communism, it immediately triggers a fight for their survival. And this is true of literally every single communist country. So when people say it's never been tried before, this is probably the single most important factor. Because anyone who's a communist revolutionary who actually succeeds in overtaking the government, their dream then is to enact all the ideas that they have. But literally none of them have ever had the chance to do that, because the first thing that happens when a communist revolution happens is the counter-revolutionaries appear, and all of them are funded by capitalists. So it used to be predominantly UK that did it. They were the big capitalists back in the early 20th century. And then America, of course, subsequently after that. So let's start at the very beginning then, because Russia, of course, is the biggest and first and most famous of the communist revolutions. And when Lenin managed to take power, the very first thing that happened is the White Russians, which was a coalition of the former Duma, former monarchists, people loyal to the Tsar, general centrist and far right-wing people formed a coalition which they called the White Russians, as opposed to the Red Russians, the communists, the Soviets. This kicked off a massive and bloody civil war that was absolutely co-sponsored and funded by America and Britain. In fact, they even sent troops to the Russian Civil War to help fight it. And this changes everything, because years and years of bloody fighting and millions dead meant that even though the communists win, they are paranoid forevermore, because they're shocked that they had to face such international backlash. And even for decades after the Civil War, the Soviet Union isn't recognized as a government. Like, if the UN was around back then, they didn't recognize the Soviet Union. They saw it as this guerrilla army that's just taken over a legitimate country under the Tsar, and have created this thing that they don't recognize. And this, of course, leads into the Stalin years, and that's the basis of his philosophy, because he was knee-deep in the Civil War when it was happening, and he grew very, very paranoid, which is a famous, trait of his. This would, of course, lead to the Great Purge in 1936, 1937, where thousands and thousands of military personnel would be killed by Stalin because he believed that they were secretly working for, basically forces of the White Russians. And even still, even though the fact that Russia had been destroyed by civil war, plagued by national security and paranoia, look at the things they still managed to do. Like, they still managed to have the highest literacy rate in the world. They became the second most industrialized country on the planet. Not by GDP, but just in terms of total amount of factories and whatnot. Russia's the second highest in the world. They kick off housing stability and farming stability and just all these innovations that really start coming out of this new way of thinking and just giving everyone the ability to live the life and live their maximum ability, which is absolutely something that happens in the early years of the Soviet Union. And you think, okay, well, finally they're about to get on track and maybe they can prove that communism works. And then, of course, they get invaded by the Germans and it kicks off the biggest war in human history. And Russia gets devastated again. And out of the end of that, so Stalin won't live for much longer after World War II. He dies in 1952. Khrushchev takes over after that. And everyone's just exhausted because it has been non-stop slaughter, war, fear, worry for the first, 30 years of the Soviet Union. And a lot of the belief in this system is already starting to wear off because everyone has just seen nothing but horror. And Russia devolves into corruption not long after this. And then by the time of the Gorbachev years, it is done. It is not dissimilar to what's happening to America now. The corruption just starts to infect everything. Now, let's look at some other countries, somewhere like Cuba. Now, Cuba probably has the most successful of all the communist revolutions. Castro does enact all of the ideas that he wants to do. He has a little problem vote, and that's America will not stop trying to kill him. There's something like 150 attempts on his life by the CIA throughout his reign. There's the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the Americans try to land a bunch of basically capitalist mercenaries to go and retake the island. And then, of course, there's the blockade. Communist Cuba, for almost its entire existence, has had a ring of US Navy ships around it, blocking anyone from trading with them, from interacting or giving Cuba any chance to breathe, because they just want Cuba to fail. And even still, Cuba today has one of the best medical systems in the entire world. They have world-renowned doctors. They have one of the lowest levels of poverty in the world, one of the highest levels of education. And they've managed to do this even while being under blockade. So it shows that this system can work if it has a chance to breathe. Imagine what Cuba could do if it wasn't under this blockade. And you could look at China and Vietnam, both examples of, Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong are both big visionaries and big theorists in communism, but both of them spend their entire existence fighting for their lives. China, of course, will have a huge civil war between a whole bunch of factions, because there's the nationalist government, which is now in Taiwan now. There's a communist, and then there's all these warlords all over the place. And they're at war with the Japanese. And this just devastates China. But even still, here we are, 70 years after their revolution, and they're arguably the most powerful country in the world. And again, you see the same sorts of things you see. You see high education, low poverty, really good medical services. These are communist traits that do happen. But again, they spend their whole time being embargoed, being attacked, and of course the US trying to do regime change all the damn time, which is why they back Taiwan. Anyway, all this is to say that I think you can make a case that communism hasn't been tried. And I reckon if you just took a random country and we just chose to do a global social experiment, pick one country and let them have unfettered communism for 10 years, I wonder how far they would get. Because if they're not fighting for their lives, and if they're not in constant war and not having to fight off capitalists trying to overthrow their government, I reckon they would actually have a shot. Anyway, I don't know how we would bring about that experiment, but it's something to think about.